Ever feel like common sense just, I don't know, flies out the window when Washington starts talking about the economy?
Oh, definitely. Like, there's this huge disconnect between what economists say makes sense and, well, what actually ends up happening.
Exactly. And that feeling, that gap, is precisely what Alan S. Blinder tackles in his book, Advice and Dissent.
Yeah, why America suffers when economics and politics collide. And Blinder, I mean, he's a real heavyweight in economics.
He's not just watching from the sidelines either, is he? He's been right in the middle of it all.
Absolutely. You know, he was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board back in the mid-90s.
Okay.
And he was on President Clinton's economic team from the very beginning, back in '93. So, yeah, he's seen firsthand how the policy sausage gets made.
He comes from a center-left viewpoint, the book mentions, but he's aiming for objectivity here.
That seems to be the goal. He acknowledges his perspective, but really tries to give a straight, analytical look at why these two worlds, economics and politics, just seem to clash so often. They're almost speaking different languages sometimes.
Advice and Dissent? Yeah, the title itself hints at that friction. So what's the core question he's wrestling with?
He's fundamentally trying to understand this constant tension. You've got economists trying to, illuminate the best path forward using data, using analysis.
Seeking illumination, as he puts it.
Exactly. And then you've got politicians whose main job really is seeking support. That means votes, campaign cash, good media coverage.
Right, staying in power or getting elected.
And Blinder wants to know why this clash so often leads to economic policies that are, frankly, suboptimal, not as good as they probably could be. And it's worth noting, he mentions getting comments from a really wide range of people for the book, so it's not just his isolated view.
Okay, so this clash of civilizations, that's a strong phrase he uses. For us trying to get our heads around this, what are the key things we need to unpack from the book?
Well, I think we should start with Blinder himself, his background, especially the Fed stuff, to see where he's coming from.
Good idea. Context is key.
Then we'll really dig into the core differences, how economics and politics just operate on different wavelengths. Why good advice gets ignored is a big one.
Yeah, that's the frustrating part.
We'll also look at the Fed as this kind of interesting exception, maybe. A place where expertise seems to matter more.
Okay.
Then, the roadblocks ideology, elections, all that stuff that gets in the way of good policy. And importantly, Blinder's own ideas for maybe making things a bit better.
Does he offer concrete examples?
Oh yeah, plenty of memorable stories and examples that really bring the issues to life. We'll touch on how the book might have landed, and finally, who this is really for, who should pick it up.
Sounds like a solid roadmap. Let's start with Blinder's own experience.
Yeah.
Stepping into that high-level political world in the 90s must have been quite a shift for an academic.
He actually describes feeling like a bit of a fish out of water initially. He talks about his very first meeting with Clinton's new economic team. January '93, Little Rock. And the room is just packed with these huge figures, Wall Street types like Robert Rubin, Roger Altman, seasoned political hands like Lloyd Bentsen, Leon Panetta, Ron Brown.
Wow. Big names.
Yeah, and then the campaign folks, too, Stephanopoulos, Gene Sperling, Robert Reich. And Blinder, coming from this, more technical, research-focused background, he felt a bit overwhelmed by all that political and financial clout.
I remember reading a story about the seating arrangement at that meeting. It says something, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a fantastic little anecdote. So initially, Vice President Gore is at one end, Blinder's seated not too far away. Then the press photographers come in, and suddenly Gore is kind of shuffled down towards Blinder's end, making room for other high-ranking officials. Then Clinton walks in, sits at the other end, and there's another reshuffle.
Musical chairs at the highest level.
Pretty much. And Blinder's instant lesson was, where you sit depends on where you stand. A stark introduction to the political hierarchy,
Definitely highlights the pecking order.
Yeah, and later that week, they're all crammed onto this charter plane, and he jokes to Robert Reich, who is focused on workplace safety, about OSHA regulations for the plane, just kind of highlighting the gap between policy ideals and the sometimes chaotic reality.
So right from the start, it wasn't just about economic models. The political dimension was impossible to ignore.
Absolutely hammered home. And it shows that his analysis in the book isn't just abstract theory. It comes from being in those rooms, seeing how these calculations are made, why the economic logic sometimes takes a back seat.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Let's get into that core conflict then. How exactly do economics and politics clash? What are the fundamental fault lines?
Well, the most basic thing is they just have different objectives, right? Politicians fundamentally need support.
Votes, money, Good press.
Exactly. That's the currency they deal in. Economists, at least in theory, are supposed to be searching for the most effective solutions based on evidence and analysis.
Seeking the truth or the best path, regardless of popularity.
Ideally, yes. So it's support versus, let's say, optimal outcomes based on analysis. That's clash number one.
And I guess that leads to different time horizons, too. Politicians thinking short-term, economists long-term.
That's a huge one. Politicians are almost always thinking about the next election cycle. 2 years, 4 years, maybe 6 for senators.
Always the next campaign.
Right. Whereas economists are often analyzing effects over years, decades even. Think about climate change policy or Social Security reform or managing national debt. The impacts are long-term.
So a policy that makes perfect economic sense for the next 20 years might be political poison right now.
Precisely. It could involve short-term pain or unpopular choices that a politician just can't afford before an election.
And how does that affect how they, talk about things, the messaging?
Oh, completely differently. Politicians thrive on simple, memorable messages, slogans, sound bites. Blinder mentions Newt Gingrich's old 40-second rule for explaining things.
And it's probably like 10 seconds now with social media.
Probably. Accuracy, nuance, complexity. Those often get sacrificed for something that grabs attention easily. Think about, say, trade protectionism. Tariffs save American jobs. Simple, sounds good.
But the reality?
Much messier, right. Involves exchange rates, retaliation, effects on consumers, effects on industries that use the imported goods. It's complicated.
Whereas economists tend to.
Well, economists often qualify everything. They use jargon. Their explanations, as Blinder kind of jokes, can be soporific, maybe a bit prolix, long-winded. Not exactly tweetable.
The detailed footnote versus the catchy headline.
That's a good way to put it. And there's another related issue. Diffuse gains versus concentrated losses.
Explain that one.
Okay, so take free trade again. Economists might argue it creates broad benefits for the whole economy, cheaper goods for everyone, more efficiency. But those benefits are spread thinly across millions of people.
Okay, I get a slightly cheaper TV, maybe?
Right, but the losses say a factory closing in a specific town are highly concentrated and deeply felt by a smaller group.
And that smaller group is going to be much louder politically.
You got it. They have a strong incentive to organize, to lobby, to protest. The millions who get a small benefit, they're usually silent. So politically, the concentrated pain often outweighs the diffuse gain, even if the total gain is bigger.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
So the tension is baked in. But why does the expert advice seem to get, ignored so often? What stops good economic ideas from becoming policy?
Blinder talks about this unholy trinity that tends to dominate actual policy decisions, often sidelining the pure economic advice.
An unholy trinity. It sounds dramatic. What is it?
It's politics, message, and process. Politics means all the stuff we just talked about, campaign promises, keeping your party happy, getting votes in Congress, dealing with interest groups.
Okay. Standard political maneuvering.
Then message, how do you sell this policy? What's the spin? How do you frame it so it sounds good and avoids getting killed by a negative soundbite?
The marketing aspect.
Exactly. And finally, process, just navigating the incredibly complex machinery of the U.S. government. Checks and balances, committees, regulations, bureaucracy.
What Blinder calls Madison's curse.
Yeah, the fact that our system is deliberately set up to make enacting big changes difficult. You need to build coalitions, you need to market your ideas aggressively just to get them through the system. So policy often fails not because the economics are bad, but because it gets tripped up by the politics, the messaging, or the sheer difficulty of the process.
And ideology plays a role too, right? Pre-existing beliefs.
Huge role. People filter advice through their own ideological lenses. Blinder notes that, generally speaking, most economists tend to be centrists. They reject the extremes on both the far right and far left, which can sometimes put them at odds with the more polarized political environment.
Does Blinder think economists themselves bear any blame here? You mentioned a blind spot.
He does point out what he calls a second blind spot for some economists. It's this tendency to focus heavily on overall efficiency, making the economic pie bigger.
Right, maximizing GDP or whatever.
And sometimes neglecting the distributional consequences. Who actually wins? Who loses? How is that bigger pie being sliced up?
Which is like the number one thing politicians and voters care about.
Absolutely. If economists just present a policy saying this is efficient, but don't address the fairness or the distributional impact, they can seem out of touch. Their advice becomes much easier for politicians to dismiss because it doesn't answer the questions people are actually asking. Politically, ignoring who gets what is often a non-starter.
It's interesting, though, because Blinder does point to the Federal Reserve as a place where economic expertise seems to, well, work better. Why is the Fed different?
Yeah, the Fed, particularly in setting monetary policy, is often held up as a kind of success story for technocratic, expert-driven policymaking. Blinder identifies three key ingredients.
Okay, what are they?
First, monetary policy is inherently technical. Setting interest rates, managing the money supply, it genuinely requires deep economic expertise. It's not something easily swayed by popular opinion alone.
Makes sense. You need the PhDs for that.
Second, the Fed generally operates with a very long time horizon. They're focused on things like long-term price stability, maximum sustainable employment. They're not beholden to the next election cycle in the same way Congress or the White House is.
And insulation is key, probably.
Definitely. And third, linked to that, the Fed has shown a willingness to inflict short-term pain when necessary for long-term gain. Think about raising interest rates to fight inflation, which can slow the economy and cost jobs in the short run.
That's politically unpopular, but they do it.
They do it because their mandate and structure allow them to focus on the longer-term economic health, somewhat shielded from those immediate political headwinds that batter fiscal policy, taxing and spending decisions.
So monetary policy has this unique combination of technical need, long horizon, and political insulation.
Pretty much. It's a stark contrast to many other economic policy areas where the political calculations often dominate.
Let's dive back into those barriers then. We know about short time horizons. What else consistently gets in the way of, let's say, sensible long-term economic policy?
Well, those short time horizons have specific consequences. Blinder mentions David Stockman's old line about politicians only seeing 2 years and one congressional district.
A narrow view.
Very, and this really hampers things like tackling budget deficits or ensuring Social Security's long-term solvency. He points to how the Congressional Budget Office often scores policies over a 10-year window.
Okay.
That sounds long, but it can actually incentivize policies that look good in years 8, 9, 10, but have terrible consequences in year 11 and beyond. It creates these sort of tax cliffs or spending cliffs. Social Security, by contrast, needs like a 75-year analysis, but the political system struggles to think that far ahead.
Kicking the can down the road. What about path dependence? What does that mean in this context?
Path dependence is basically the idea that where you are now heavily influences where you can go next. History matters. Initial choices constrain future options.
Like once a program is established, it's really hard to change or get rid of it.
Exactly. Politicians understand this very well. They know how entrenched certain policies or benefits become. Economists sometimes focus too much on the theoretical best solution, forgetting how hard it is to shift from the current path, even if it's not ideal. The existing setup has inertia.
And then there are the special interests, the lobbyists.
Always a factor. Blinder gives this example from the huge 1986 tax reform, a really complex bill. Buried inside was this tiny, obscure exception specifically benefiting municipal bonds, likely put there by lobbyists.
A carve-out.
Yeah, one of many small outrages, as he calls them. Each one might seem minor, but they add up. And they feed this public perception that the whole system is rigged, that it's full of loopholes for the well-connected.
Which makes broad, fair reforms even harder to sell.
Definitely fuels cynicism. And on top of that, you just have raw partisan politics.
Scoring points against the other side.
Right. Often the goal isn't necessarily to find the best policy solution, but to block the other party, or make them look bad, or pass anything just to claim a victory. Blinder mentions the prolonged efforts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, often without a clear consensus on what would replace it. The political goal overshadowed the policy substance.
It's a bit depressing, listing all these barriers. Does Blinder offer any hope, any ideas for reform?
He does try to end on a slightly more optimistic note. He floats what he calls a hopeful hypothesis.
Okay, I'm listening. Hopeful sounds good.
His idea is that maybe, just maybe, the public is getting tired of the constant political spin. That because genuine straight talk is becoming so scarce, its value might actually increase.
The scarcity principle applied to political honesty. Interesting thought.
It is. Whether it's true is another question, but it's a hopeful angle. He also talks about the media's role here.
As the intermediaries, what's their challenge?
Well, they're caught in the middle. There's the pressure to appear balanced, which can sometimes lead to false equivalence, giving equal weight to expert consensus and, say, fringe theories.
Right, the both sides problem, even when one side is demonstrably false.
Exactly. And the lines between news reporting and opinion are increasingly blurred. Blinder cites PolitiFact data comparing the truthfulness of statements by Clinton and Trump, just as an example of how different the factual basis of political discourse can be.
And potential conflicts of interest between politicians and the media. Leaks for access.
He touches on that too, framing it as a kind of principal-agent problem. Who is the journalist really serving? Their audience or their source, who gives them scoops in exchange for maybe favorable coverage. It's complex.
Blinder also has this personal philosophy. He advocates hard-headed but soft-hearted. What does that mean in practice?
It's a guiding principle he proposes. The hard head is about being rigorous, analytical, respecting evidence, understanding how markets work, the tough-minded economic analysis.
Okay, the pragmatic side.
But the soft heart is about having genuine concern for fairness, for equity, for those who get left behind by economic changes or who start at a disadvantage.
So efficiency and compassion.
Right. Combining market efficiency with social concern. He suggests policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, might embody this. It uses the tax system to help low-wage workers, respecting market outcomes, but providing targeted help.
So how could we apply that philosophy more broadly? How do we get more hard head and soft heart into the policy process?
Blinder suggests we need to think about moving the line, even just a bit, between what's decided politically and what's delegated more to technical experts, operating under political guidelines, of course.
Like the Fed model, but for other areas.
Sort of.
Yeah.
He mentions ideas like independent infrastructure banks, where project selection is based more on objective cost-benefit analysis rather than political clout. Maybe even an independent board for tax policy details, setting rates within bands decided by Congress.
Are there examples where this has worked outside the Fed?
He points to things like the Defense-Base Closure and Realignment Commission, BRK. Congress hated closing bases in their districts, so they created an independent commission to make the tough calls, and Congress just voted yes or no on the whole package. Fast-track authority for tree deals is another example, limiting Congress's ability to tinker endlessly.
Giving experts a bit more room to maneuver, insulated from direct political pressure.
Exactly. He also stresses the need for longer time horizons, especially right after an election when maybe there's more political capital. And he emphasizes compromise, looking back at the 1986 tax reform as a model where linkage, trading different priorities, and some backroom dealing were actually crucial to success.
You mentioned Blinder uses lots of examples. Can you share a few more that really stick out?
Sure. There's the one about Paul Begala, Clinton's strategist, insisting they call the 1993 budget plan an economic growth package, not a deficit reduction package, even though deficit reduction was a huge part of it. Pure messaging.
Framing is everything.
Totally. Then there's the Laffer curve story, the idea that cutting tax rates could magically increase tax revenue, hugely appealing politically, especially to conservatives.
But the economic evidence was pretty thin, wasn't it? At least for the tax rates at the time.
Very thin for the kinds of cuts being proposed then. It shows how an economically dubious idea can gain political traction. Another example, how a CBO report on the Affordable Care Act was spun by opponents to claim it would cause massive job losses, when the report actually talked about people choosing to work less because they no longer needed employer health insurance.
A total misrepresentation of the analysis.
Right. On the flip side, he highlights the success of the cap-and-trade system for acid rain as a win for economic logic, using market mechanisms to solve an environmental problem efficiently.
What about things that failed politically despite economic arguments?
The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP trade deal, is a prime example. Most economists saw overall benefits, but the fear of concentrated job losses, amplified by political rhetoric on both left and right, made it deeply unpopular. Classic diffused gains versus concentrated losses.
Any others?
Well, the whole issue of rising income inequality. Economists, even the IMF, pointed data showing it might be dragging down overall growth. But tackling it through things like tax reform runs into huge political obstacles. Remember Senator Russell Long's quote?
Don't tax you, don't tax me.
Tax that fella behind the tree. Perfectly captures the politics of closing popular loopholes, like, say, the mortgage interest deduction. Everyone agrees loopholes are bad in general, but nobody wants their loophole closed.
Which explains why bipartisan efforts like the Simpson-Bowles Commission on deficit reduction ultimately failed, while the '86 tax reform, with its specific dynamics, succeeded.
Exactly. And things like the Volcker Rule in financial reform, incredibly complex, trying to prevent risky behavior, but facing constant pushback because complexity creates political targets. He even shares a personal story about being misinterpreted after a talk at Jackson Hole due to leaks, shows the tightrope experts walk.
Given all this in Blinder's profile, how do you think the book landed when it came out in 2018?
Well, we don't have specific reviews in our notes here, but based on the acknowledgments, he thanks a lot of prominent people across the spectrum. It almost certainly stirred up quite a bit of discussion in economic and policy circles.
Seemed time for the political climate then, too.
Definitely. Coming out early in the Trump administration, an era marked by, let's say, unconventional approaches to expertise and policy. The book's themes about the clash between evidence and politics felt particularly relevant. It likely provided a framework for people trying to make sense of what was happening.
So for our listeners, who should really make time for advice and dissent? Who is this book for?
I'd say for you listening, especially if you fit that learner profile, curious, wanting to understand things deeply but also efficiently, this book is fantastic. It cuts through a lot of noise.
It's for anyone puzzled by that gap we talked about at the start?
Exactly. If you've ever watched the news about some economic debate and thought, wait, why aren't they just doing the obvious thing? This book explains the why. It helps you look past the headlines and see the underlying machinery, the inherent tensions.
So it provides those aha moments.
Lots of them, I think. It gives you a lens for understanding why economic policy often seems so messy and sometimes counterintuitive. It's a guide to that confusing intersection where economic theory meets political reality, but it does it in a really accessible way.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. If we boil down our deep dive into Blinder's advice and dissent, what are the core takeaways?
I think the biggest one is just recognizing this fundamental, almost unavoidable conflict between the goals and methods of economics and politics. One seeks illumination through analysis, the other seeks support through votes and influence.
And this conflict creates barriers.
Huge barriers. Short time horizons, the complexity of the U.S. system, Madison's curse, plus the power of ideology and special interests, all make it really hard to implement purely rational economic policy.
But the Fed stands out a bit.
The Fed, especially on monetary policy, shows that it is possible for expertise to play a leading role thanks to its technical nature, long-term focus, and relative independence.
And Blinder's message is ultimately about finding a better balance.
Yeah, he's not saying economists should rule the world, but he is arguing for finding ways to give sound economic advice a better hearing, to nudge that line between politics and technocracy, and maybe adopt that hard-headed, soft-hearted approach more often.
So a final thought for our listeners to chew on. As you watch current economic debates unfold, maybe about inflation or debt or climate policy, think about Blinder's framework.
Yeah, ask yourself, where are the economic arguments clashing with the political imperatives? Where are the short-term pressures overwhelming the long-term needs? And maybe consider which parts of these decisions should be driven more by expert analysis and which rightly belong in the messy but necessary realm of political debate and public opinion.
Understanding that fundamental tension that clash Blinder describes really is vital if we want to be informed citizens and push for policies that lead to a more prosperous future.